So, we were talking about pollination. Pollination is the transfer of pollen, the male reproductive cells, from the anther to a stigma. And this is what you can see here, this is a real picture. This is what the pollen grains look like. And actually, they land on the stigma and they go down this little canal until they reach the ovary, which is where they fertilize the female cells. We can have two different types of pollination. We can have what we call self-pollination. In this case, the pollen from the same flower is transferred from the anthers of the same flower is transferred to the stigma of the same flower. The advantage of self-pollination is that it guarantees reproduction. Even if there is only one plant around, or if the plants are very far apart, or whatever, if self-pollination is possible, then there's guaranteed reproduction. The disadvantage is that, genetically speaking, self-pollination is not a positive feature because you don't have any genetic variability. Now, just to give you an example that I imagine most of you know, when we talk about inbreeding, have you heard that? Have you heard the term? When we talk about reproduction between individuals that are closely related genetically, this can be people that are closely related, or sometimes when you have closed communities where there's a lot of intermarriage inside a family, then what happens is that, and we won't go into the genetics of it, you can find an explanation for it any place on the internet, but basically what happens is that the minute there's less variability, there's a better chance of qualities that are not positive qualities increasing. And so we find in populations where there's a lot of inbreeding, there are also a lot of hereditary diseases, or in some cases also hereditary defects. So for example, we know, if you look in people, we know that there are certain diseases that are typical of Jewish populations. We have certain diseases that we know are Jewish hereditary diseases. And the same thing, you will find that in other populations. Many of the Jewish hereditary diseases have been investigated extensively, but you will find the same thing in many other closed populations where there is a lot of intermarriage. Okay, so this is just one example. Here, for example, in Israel, you can find that in many places where there are villages or communities where for many years there has been a lot of intermarriage, there are certain traits that are more dominant there than they are in the general population. Yes?
You're using the term intermarriage, which usually to me means Jews marrying non-Jews.
No, that's not what we're talking about now.
I know, but you're saying intramarriage.
Okay, sorry. Yes, intramarriage. Intramarriage within when you have within a closed population, you have a lot of, it's not really intramarriage, it's inbreeding. That's what comes out. So the same thing happens with plants and animals. So self-pollination basically is not considered a positive trait. But when you have plants that are very rare, for example, and this is particularly true for plants, when you have plants that are very rare or that are spread very far apart, the ability to self-pollinate is definitely an advantage. Okay, and so actually what we have, and this is something that we see in biology all the time, we have actually something called a trade-off. You see, what is the advantage, what is the disadvantage, and then selection usually acts to select the trait that gives the best possible result. So in this case, it's an advantage. Now we know, and we will also be talking now we're talking about pollination, but we will also be talking about vegetative reproduction, which is when one plant, for example, if anyone has seen how bulb plants grow, okay? The bulb itself reproduces and has various bulblets, which are genetically the exact same makeup as the original bulb. And many plants, these type of plants, we will soon see examples of them, geophytes, reproduce in both ways. They have both sexual reproduction and vegetative reproduction, and that ensures for them the best possible outcome. So this is self-pollination. Many plants have mechanisms that prevent self-pollination. We'll see examples soon. Forgetting this doesn't work. The second system, which is definitely the most common one, is what we call cross-pollination, and I imagine that this is something most of you have heard of. And the well-known example, of course, is the bee that goes from one flower to another. It gathers nectar and pollen and butterflies. There are many insects that do this. And when they go from one flower to another, they will be transferring pollen from one flower to another pollen, and that's how they ensure cross-pollination. And just for you to see, this is what pollen grains, this is after they've, of course, been stained and enlarged in a microscope so that you can see. Many pollen grains have all sorts of little, as you can see, little extensions that help them stick, spikes and so on, that help them stick to wherever they want to get to. And this is what it looks like. In this case, this is pollen in the respiratory system, and this is people who are allergic to pollen. This is what causes all the trouble. Okay, so when we look at, let's go back to the plants as we were talking about them, and we can see here, these are examples of monoecious plants with monosexual combs. That means that each tree here is both male and female, and in this case we're talking about conifers, pine trees and cypress and so on. They don't really have fruit. Their fruit is something we call a cone, and we can see pine cones that are, we can see pine cones that are male and that are female, and they're different in their shape. And the female pine cones, for example, in the stone pine, which is a species that grows very rarely naturally in Israel, but there are also planted ones. And some are even grown agriculturally. This is where you get this is the species that gives the best pine nuts. But the pine nuts are example of seeds in pine cones. The Aleppo pine that you can see over here, by the way, this picture is taken here at the entrance to the Hebrew University, if you've ever seen it. These are two large cypress trees that are over there. The Aleppo pine is a species that exists naturally in this area, and this is for whoever came to ask me about things like what is natural and what not. We have natural Aleppo pines, but for many years it was also the main species used by the British and the Jewish National Fund for afforestation, for planting trees. And the species that were, the Aleppo pines that were brought were not native ones, because for afforestation, they found strains from, I think from Greece, they were brought from other countries in Europe that were considered stronger. Nowadays, by the way, this is not so much for now, but nowadays afforestation is done with many different types of species, not just with this, but most of the pine forests that we see, when you see pine forests that where all the pines look exactly the same, most of them were planted with Aleppo pine. And as I said, and there have been several studies done here to investigate the genetics and tell the difference between the species that are, the trees that are native trees and the ones that are planted trees. Another one of the common natural species that we have here of Israel's native species, which is also monoecious and monosexual. This is our oak trees. We have several species of oak trees here. We have the Kirby's oak, which is the most, it's also called the, and when I'll write the other name down here also. Today it's called the Palestinian oak. This is the name that it originally had. Same problem that we have, as I said, with giving common names to the trees. So this is the most common oak tree we have in the center of the country, and also all the way up north to the Galilee. And then we have the Tabor oak, which is found in warmer areas. It can be found around Beit Shemesh and also in the Golan Heights. And we have the cypress oak, which grows in cooler areas. And you can see here that the way to tell them apart is by the shape of their fruits. When you get to know them, obviously you can also tell them apart by the way they look. But in any case, this is the what in its Hebrew name. In Hebrew, this is what's called the common oak, and that's why its name now has also been changed in English to the Palestinian oak, because it's the most common oak in the center of the country.
But fruits are only in the female plants, right?
All the plants are both male and female.
Oh.
Monoecious means that they're on one plant.
Okay, so you have female and male flowers?
What? Yes, exactly. You have female and male flowers on the same plant. These are shrubs, not trees.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Are any of the fruits edible? Of the pine,
the
pine?
As I said, stone pine, the pine notes are used, and in the oak, there are various people that specialize in making things, in using the natural species that you have growing. You can make theoretically coffee from, I think, from the Palestinian oak, but they're not species that have any use in agriculture, or that in, yes.
Which oak is the most readily available oak, you said?
Wh-
And it's called the Palestinian oak?
The,
The Tabor?
no,
No.
Alon Matsui, Kermit.
Alon Matsui,
Okay, got it.
okay?
Okay.
Yeah. No, I will change the name on the slide, sorry. Okay, so this is probably one of the most common shrubs. I'm sure many of you have seen it. It exists throughout the Mediterranean region in Israel, but it also It's particularly, you can see it, large expanses of it in the Judean lowlands, which is around the Bet Shemesh area. If you go where you have open spaces that haven't been built up yet, where there are no trees, you will see a lot of these shrubs. This is another shrub that we have towards more, can be found throughout the Jordan Valley and some parts of the Judean desert, also the shrubby salt bush. Now, when we have, sometimes we have flowers that don't seem to be, it seems to us, when if any of you have seen this one, the Palestinian arum, it's flowering now, and actually what we have, and we'll see that in the next slide, on the same flower are male and female flowers. So patience, we will look at it in another minute, okay? Here. So this is what it looks like. The female flowers are below the male flowers, and that prevents.
Excuse me, can you take a photo of the first slide, please, of the same flower? We just missed it.
Oh, okay, you'll get the presentation.
Oh, we will.
That's what I told you at the beginning. Within a week, you will get the presentation. You do not have to take photos of it. But here, take a look at it again.
Thank you.
Okay? This is what it looks like when it grows in nature. Okay? And this is what it looks like when we take a picture of it close up. This is what we call the spathe. Okay? That's like the covering on the outside. So what happens here is that the female flowers are below the male flowers, and they bloom first. So by the time the male flowers bloom, the female flowers have completed blooming. And this is in one flower. Different flowers, of course, there's a difference in timing. And that's why you can only have cross-pollination. All this is done to prevent self-pollination. Here we have dioecious plants. Dioecious plants means that we have a plant. Second, we have a plant with monosexual flowers. That you have flowers that are male and female flowers also. Just a second. No. In this case, you have separate plants, okay? Separate plants, male plants and female plants. This is probably the second most common tree in the Mediterranean region. It's called the terebinth, and it grows in most places. It grows together with the Palestinian oak. This is another example of a dioecious plant. In other words, where you have male and female trees.
Excuse me,
Yes.
the terebinth one, I know that somewhere it's noted somewhere in Tanakh. Do you know where it's quoted, or do you have a reference to where it's connected?
No, I don't have it offhand. I can look for it. But you
Abraham
can.
was sitting on Terebinth 3 when he just came.
Yeah, the question is whether there's a problem in the translations. There's a problem with the translations of the Bible and the names that they give to the trees. If you want to know the correct name, what you should do is go into the website of the Academy for the Hebrew Language, where they usually will also give you mention the sources, and then you can see why it was decided that this is the name of this. Because, for example, Abraham's terebinth is called in Hebrew Eshel Avraham. Eshel is a completely different species, and in other words, it's don't rely on the common names for finding.
The Atlantic pistachia, is it the Atlantic pistachia or the Atlantic pistachio? Because we were told it was a pistachio.
The name is supposed to be an Atlantic pistachia, not pistachio. It is, by the way, the species, one of its related species is the species from which pistachio nuts were, but we don't naturally have the pistachio tree here. In Hebrew, it's called elata fistuk, which is a different species, which was brought in for agriculture. We don't have it naturally in this region.
We were down south, and the guide said it's called the Atlantic pistachio. He said pistachio in the fun.
I don't know what the guide showed you. I'm telling you, botanically speaking, down south near Sde Boker, there is a grove of pistachio trees that were brought, that were cultivated for the pistachio nuts. That's not the Atlantic pistachio. That I don't know what its name in English is. I can check, but I don't know. What?
Pistachio needs a very cold area to grow.
Right.
So I don't know how it can be cultivated for the Negev.
It's cultivated in the Negev highlands. The Negev highland is its phytogeographic region is the Irano-Turanian region. It is very cold. I don't know if you've been in Mitzpe Ramon or Yerucham in the wintertime. It gets very cold there. It gets colder than Jerusalem. And so these species grow in the Negev highlands. They won't grow in the Negev is very varied. It's not all the same thing. Yes.
What about when they call it elata mastic? Why would they?
Okay, elata mastic is a different species and it's a shrub. It's not a tree.
That's the shrub. Okay.
Okay?
Got it. Yeah.
So these are different species of trees. It's true that all the elot are pistacia. Okay? They're all called pistacia something. Okay, so these are other, here, this is the in English, by the way, it's called the lentisk, the elata mastic, okay? It's a large shrub. It's also very common in the Mediterranean region. I'm not going to go into each one of these. You have the slides that will give you the information. And what I suggest is that when you're out in the field, you can try to identify them. It is, if you're into plants, you'll be able to learn and identify many plants. But even if you're not, you should know the main tree species that you have in every region. And we'll see some examples of the of the plant associations that we have in different parts of the country. Okay? So here is, okay, so in this case, what you have here, these are, that's the carob tree. Here you can see the male, this is what the male tree, these are what the male flowers look like, and this is the female tree, which can be very easily recognized by its fruit. And carob trees are one of the easier cases, okay? In this case also, what you can see here, this is the lentisk. So the ones where you have the colorful fruit, those are the female trees, and the ones where you don't see colorful fruit are the male trees. And on the other hand, you have something like a plant, like this is the gladiola. This is a native species here. We're not talking about the gladiolas that you buy at the flower stand. And what you can see here is that the flowers here are the typical flowers that we know. They're both that are perfect flowers or hermaphroditic flowers. Every flower has both male and female organs. And they're all on one plant. How does pollination take place? So we saw the process that we're all familiar with are when insects pollinate plants, but there are many other ways that pollination takes place. For example, pollination can be by the wind. This is typical, by the way, of most of the conifers. Most of the pine trees are pollinated by wind. Plants that are pollinated by, and most of the grains also, wheat and oak, not oak, oats. The natural species are all pollinated by, in this case, by wind. And what is typical of plants that are pollinated by wind is that they do not invest in developing colors and so on, because there's no need to attract any pollinator. This happens completely randomly. The amount of pollen created by plants that are pollinated by wind or also pollinated by water, we don't have any of those in this region, or very few, so we won't mention them, but the amount of pollen that's produced in plants that are pollinated by wind is much, much larger. In other words, they produce very large amounts of pollen because the pollination process is completely random. It's not like a bee that goes from one plant to another, that there is a certain percentage of success that is pretty much ensured. In this case, the wind takes the pollen, wherever it lands, it lands. With luck, some of it will land on other plants. Obviously, there is pollination. We know there are new plants being formed all the time. Okay? Pollination by animals is, in this case, the flower, the plant uses its flower to advertise itself to animals, to attract the animals. And the animals can be bees, or it can be, the caterpillars don't pollinate. The butterflies pollinate. The caterpillars eat the leaves, okay? And we also have, by the way, not all the pollinators. If we take something, for example, like the ladybug that you see here, ladybugs, by the way, are a problem because on one hand they do pollinate. It's true, they transfer pollen from one plant to another, but they also eat a lot of the pollen. So the pollination process is a lot less effective. And this is just to show you, if anyone didn't believe how much pollen a bee can transfer from one plant to another, this can give you a pretty good idea. One of the things that we find in plants that are pollinated by animals, as I said, the plant develops methods to attract the pollinators. So in this case, these are certain plants that belong to, in Hebrew, their name is much more intuitive. They're called dvoraniot. Dvora is a bee, and dvoranit is a flower that looks like a bee, which is what you can see over here. And in this case, it's a carpenter bee. Carpenter bee is a type of wild bee that's not a honeybee, and it is pollinating. As you can see, it goes in for the nectar, and while it does that, look at what's happening. These are the anthers rubbing against it and leaving pollen on its back. So the way the flower is built in this case is specifically to make the pollination process more effective. The flowers are colorful to attract the insects, and they're built in a manner that when the bee comes in to reach the nectar, the pollen will rub off on it. This is anyone who's comes here from the New World, North America, South America, knows hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are birds that pollinate flowers. They come for the nectar, and the flowers in the parts of the world where they exist, you find specific flowers that are adapted to that are exactly suited to the hummingbird that comes to pollinate them. In the old world, in Asia, and in our area, we have one species. In Asia and in Africa, we have a bird that looks very much like the hummingbird, and it is called a sunbird. And in Africa, you have many species of sunbirds. We have one species of sunbird that is believed to be here from the African incursion that there was along the Rift Valley before the climate change. And what's interesting, the difference, by the way, one of the main differences between hummingbirds and sunbirds is that hummingbirds can, besides for flying backwards, they can reach the nectar without standing on the flower. By hovering, they can reach the nectar. Sunbirds, which are very common in Israel since the gardens have developed and they've spread throughout also the Mediterranean area, not just the Rift Valley, have to stand on the flower to reach the nectar. This, I don't know if you've seen it on the acacia trees when you were in En-Gedi. This is the acacia strap flower, which is a parasitic plant that lives off acacia trees, and it is exactly adapted. The hummingbird's beak is exactly adapted to this flower. But of course, in this region, for example, we don't have acacia strap flowers, and the hummingbirds have found garden flowers or also some of the native species that are just right for their beak. But what do they do when the flower isn't suited to their beak? So for example, the hummingbirds have learned how to reach the nectar of the hibiscus. The hibiscus is an imported plant. It's a garden plant here in Israel, and which, by the way, doesn't spread naturally because it doesn't have a natural pollinator here. And its structure is adapted to a type of sunbird in China with a very long bill. But our sunbird doesn't have a bill that's long enough. So how does it reach the nectar? It steals the nectar. It makes a hole at the base of the flower where the nectar is located, takes nectar from there. Why is this called stealing nectar? Because it doesn't pollinate the flower when it does that. In other words, the flower has no benefit from it at all. And since it's a very common flower in gardens, it's also, I think you can find it here on the campus. I suggest that you go, when you see flowering ones, take a look at their bases. You will see some that have a little hole that was pricked by the sunbird when it came to steal the nectar. Okay, so this is, we're not even going to talk about this. This is just a slide to sum up what we spoke about, the differences between plants that are pollinated by insects and by wind. And you will get the slide. Don't have to take a picture of it. Yes, questions?
No, I was about to say, there are no hummingbirds here.
No.
Right, okay.
We have one species of sunbird.
Right.
That's
okay,
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, fruit. After the flower is fertilized, the next stage is the fruit. Different types of fruit. We'll take a look at the fruit. By the way, is the dispersal unit of the plant. In the fruit are the seeds. The seeds are the organ from which the new plant is going to develop. So obviously, from an evolutionary point of view, what the plant wants to do is spread its seeds. And how does it do that? Also by various different methods. And we can see this here, and we'll see some examples soon. We have, it's very similar, by the way, to the pollination process. We have fruit that disperse on their own, fruit that are dispersed by the wind, or rather seeds and fruits or seeds that are dispersed by animals. And we'll soon see examples of them, okay, that are from here. So this is one of our poppy species here in Israel. We can find poppies in I think there's one species in the Negev, more common in this area, and they will start flowering after the anemones are flowering now. The red anemones are flowering now. Poppies will come after them. Poppies, this is what their fruit looks like, and what it does is it just dries, and when it dries, it opens up, and the seeds disperse right next to the parent plant. In other words, they can't get far away. This is a plant that we can see. It pretty much also grows as a weed. It's called the squirting cucumber. And when the fruit here is ripe, if you just touch it, or any animal that goes by, it bursts and squirts its seeds out, and that's how it disperses its seeds. And then you have here, this is another flower that's flowering now, the lupines. We can see them also in the Judean lowlands a lot, also in this region, and they belong to the legume family, and this is just like peas in a pod, if you want, what you can see over here. Seeds and fruits that are dispersed by wind. I am sure that everyone here as a child picked these, and you blow on them and the wind takes them wherever. And so these are examples of plants that most of by the way, the thistles that we see, the thorny plants, we have several species here, have these type of fruits, and their seeds are dispersed by the wind. This is another shrub example, the desert storkbill. And then we have, of course, the fruits that are dispersed by animals, which are interesting because we're also one of their dispersers. And what you can see, for example, this is the eastern strawberry tree. Another one of the species, we'll see a picture of the tree soon. It's this tree that has the red trunk. Have you seen it? I don't know if you've, it grows in the Mediterranean region. It grows on soils that are rich in clay. Wherever you see them, you know that the soil is rich in clay. Do you know there's a wadi near Hadassah called Wadi Nahal Ktalav? Have you heard of it? Ktalav is the eastern strawberry tree. Yeah, and there are lots of, when you go along the route, there's a high percentage of eastern strawberry trees because they like, and it shows that the soil there is the soil, one of the soil layers is what we call chavar motza, or
How to pronounce it? Katlav?
ktalav.
Katalav.
Yeah.
When we were at Bar
Yeah.
Bahar, that was my house.
Right, that's right. Right near Bar Bahar. That's it, right. Yeah. Okay. Then you have what we call,
Kofi, you were
yeah.
saying about the layer?
No, I'm saying that the Ktalav likes soil that's rich in clay. And in Nahal Ktalav, there is a large layer of what we call chavar motza, the motza marls. Marl is a type of soil that has a lot of clay in it. We also have a different type of marl in the Dead Sea area and the Judean desert, which is called the Lisan marl. But the marls in general are soils that have a high percentage of clay in them. And many people, talav, the eastern strawberry tree is a very beautiful tree. And many people try to grow them in their gardens. There are nurseries where you can buy the cultivated ones. And they're not easy to grow because they need soil that's rich in clay. And then they don't need a lot of watering because the clay keeps a lot of the water in it. In other words, it's not easy to grow them. Yes?
You say that it's animal dispersal, so the animal eats the seeds
Right.
and poops it out, and that's how it comes.
Exactly. The animals, in the case of the eastern strawberry tree, the animals eat the seeds, eat the fruit, by the way. And the fruit, that's why the fruit is red and attractive, and it's also quite tasty. I don't know if not everybody likes, but you can taste it. It's not a poisonous fruit. The animal eats the fruit and then excretes the seeds. And going through the animal's digestive tract is one of the things that catalyzes, that makes, that helps the seed germinate. Yes, sorry. That's the word I was looking for. It helps the tree germinate. This is another type of animal dispersed fruit. It's what we call hitchhikers. And I'm sure many of you, if you've been on a trip any place outside, especially towards the end of the summer, that's when most of the fruit are on the thing, we have these prickly fruits that stick to our socks and so on. Obviously, they develop to stick to the fur of animals that are living in the region, but we also help to disperse them. So these are just some of the examples. As I said, we also have plants that reproduce by vegetative reproduction. Now, I just want you to know, these also reproduce in the completely standard way. There's a flower. The flower, by the way, is a perfect flower. Each flower is male and female, and they reproduce by animal insects. Sorry, their pollinators are insects, and they reproduce that way. But they also have an alternative. And what's the alternative? These are plants that we call geophytes. Geophytes have an underground organ that can reproduce vegetatively. In other words, in the case of the I said the anemone, it's one of its relatives, the turban buttercup, which is also going to be flowering. The red flowers have a sort of succession. The first ones to flower are the anemones, and afterwards, and then you have the buttercups, and then you have the poppies, and somewhere in the middle you also have the tulips. We have natural tulips here, which don't exactly look like the Dutch tulips, and all of these have the same mechanism. They have flowers, and they can reproduce by flowers, but they also have, in the case of the buttercup, it's their corms. In the case of the narcissus, it's bulbs. A bulb looks very much like the onion. Bulbs are the base of leaves that are thickened. The corms are thickened stems. As I said, the bulb are modified stem base and fleshy food storage. Leaves, this is another, the crocus is another species that can reproduce with the help of corms and tubers, which is, by the way, the same means of reproduction that potatoes use. What is vegetation? For anyone who doesn't understand how vegetative reproduction works, if you take a potato and you keep it, and when the eyes begin developing, if you cut off the eye and plant it, a potato plant is going to develop from it. So these are methods of vegetative reproduction where you don't need any help from any other element, not an animal, not the wind, anything like that, and you don't need another plant. The disadvantage is that genetically they are all exactly the same. And then what is the problem with that? That if there is some sort of a disaster, I don't know how many of you have heard of the potato blight in Ireland, yeah? The minute, or we can go much closer to home. We know that the Aleppo pine, the Jerusalem pines in this area were attacked by oh great, now I have to remember how we call it, an aphid in this region called Matsococcus. And the Matsococcus aphid destroyed large areas of, there were all sorts of theories before they discovered this. They said, yes, that's because the pines are not native and they were planted too close together and the soil is too shallow. And it turned out that it was a type of aphid. Now, because all the pine trees were exactly the same genetically, the minute you had the aphid attacking it, it could destroy tremendous amounts of pine trees. This is just if you, for example, I'll try to bring you an example of something that's a little bit closer to home. We know, for example, that when we give antibiotics, right, against the certain bacteria, that there is always the danger of a strain of bacteria developing that it will be resistant, right? But as long as all the bacteria are the same, then the antibiotic works beautifully. And it's the same thing here. If all the trees have the same genetic makeup and a pest attacks them, it will attack all the trees. And if we want the trees to be resistant, this is like an example, the opposite of what, with antibiotics, we want them to be able to attack all the bacteria, right? But with the trees, we want to have a variety of trees so that if there is a pest, it will not kill all the trees at the same time. But there will be other species that are resistant to it. Another type of asexual or vegetative reproduction, we have rhizomes, which are thickened stems. We don't see these over, they're underground, they grow underground, and then you will see clumps of plants. By the way, we'll go back here a second. Cyclamen, if you've noticed them in nature, and it's also true of the narcissus, they grow in clumps. Why? Because they've all grown from the same root, say bulb or corm or whatever. And in this case, this is the southern daisy. And another type of vegetative reproduction, which is very common in palm trees, are offshoots. Now, if you've noticed, when you're, and I'm sure you've seen it in En-Gedi too, in all the oases in the desert, we can see this, that we have palm trees that are usually, we don't really know if they're there, if they developed naturally, or if someone was many, many years ago was eating some dates and just left the pits over there, and they reproduce from that. But the minute they reproduce that way, they do not reproduce sexually. They form these large clumps of I have it in one of the other slides. You see these large clumps of palm trees that are all coming out from the same tree, because this is what they do. They produce offshoots. Now, when we see palms that are cultivated palms, the farmers cut these off. They don't allow them to develop because they will compete with the tree for nutrients. And so then we see these nice tall palm trees. But if you see them, if they're left alone, then they will start reproducing vegetatively from offshoots. Okay, so now I've spoken to you about trees and shrubs and how do we define them? When we talk about life forms, if we're talking about trees, we usually are talking about the adult tree is taller, reaches adulthood. It's usually taller than 4 meters. Its woody parts are woody. It has woody parts. It's not just green parts. But most important, the tree is perennial and has multiple reproductive cycles. That means perennial is that it reproduces every year. Every year it produces flowers and fruits and so on, and can live for many years. So one example, of course, are all the pine trees that we have. The carob tree, even though I don't know, I was told that in the Jewish National Fund, they found that they planted in many places, they started planting carob trees in addition to the pine trees, is that the average carob tree lives for about 40 years. I know that I've been living next to my house. There's a carob tree that grew naturally. I've been living there for 40 years, and it was a tree when I came there already. So I guess they also, and it's still doing well, so maybe they do live for longer than that. Yes. Right. See, the story of Choni HaMa'agel, exactly. And how long the trees, that's why I was speaking to someone in the Jewish National Fund. And they said, wait a minute, I grew up on this story. The tree has to live at least 70 years. He said, no, we haven't found that. But I don't know, maybe my tree will live 70 years. I probably won't be around to see it. So, and then we have shrubs. Shrubs are actually small trees. They also have woody parts. They're also perennial, multiple reproductive cycles. But first of all, they don't have a single trunk. Now, by the way, just in case, we also have trees that don't necessarily have a single trunk, but they will have 2 or 3 main trunks. They won't, unlike shrubs, where you don't really see a trunk. So these are some of the shrubs that we see in the Mediterranean area. And then the next level below them are the dwarf shrubs. Again, they're perennial. They have several reproductive cycles, but in this case, they usually don't grow more than 1 meter high. And here you can see the prickly burnet that we saw before, which is probably one of the most common shrubs in the Mediterranean region. And then we have the geophytes that we mentioned before. The geophytes that we mentioned before, geophytes have no woody parts. And not only don't they have no woody parts, but the parts that are above ground are non-existent in summer. In other words, geophytes usually flower at the beginning of winter or sometime during the winter, depending on the different species. For example, the meadow saffron is called in Hebrew sitvanit, and it comes from the word stav, which is autumn. It's the first flower that we see of the geophytes, that we see flowering when winter begins. By the way, I imagine that when you learned about climate, so you know that in the Mediterranean climate, we don't really have a spring and a fall the way anyone who's come from another country knows. Both spring and fall are short seasons, intermediate season between a long summer and a much shorter winter. But when winter begins, which is usually when it rains, so then we have the geophytes appearing, and this is one. This is a small flower that's close to the ground, and its Hebrew name is Sitvanit Hayoreh. Anyone know what Yoreh is? What? No, not a shooter. Yoreh are the first rains. Okay, so these are the plants that appear with the first rains. And then you have for example, the sand iris. This is the time of the year that are they out already? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. And now the irises are, of course, actually all flowers in Israel are protected now, but all the geophytes especially, because they were very much picked by people because they're such beautiful flowers. And this is our natural tulip. And again, you can see the same thing. It grows, these are bulb and corm flowers, and they grow. Because of that, they can be seen in clumps.
Where can
Yeah.
we found the tulips?
These
Nature,
tulips?
Where?
Oh, in this region. If you walk out into the hills, around Jerusalem, you can see them. But
Harmonious, yes, and.
yeah, by now you can probably start seeing them. Yeah, the tulips. They're rarer. They're not as common, for example, as the anemones wherever they can be found, but you can find them in rocky areas. And they see exactly the way you see them here in rocky areas, in depressions in a rock, you can see something like that. If you go out, by the way, to the area around Sataf, for example, not where all the pine trees are, where the more, if you go to the more natural areas around there, good chance that you'll be able to see the tulips. Perennial herbs are have no woody parts. They live, perennial doesn't mean, they live from year to year, the same plant, okay? And they have leaves out throughout the year. Unlike the geophytes, go back to them a minute, that we said usually have leaves in winter. There are some exceptions, and we'll mention them. They have, such as the meadow saffron, it flowers before it has leaves out, but then they have leaves out, they photosynthesize with their leaves, and they store the food they produce in the corms and the bulbs and the rhizomes below ground. And then the next year, this is what's going to allow them to flower even before they put leaves out. Perennial herbs don't have bulbs or corms or anything like that. It's just a plant that has its green parts are around throughout the year. In some cases, for example, this species here, this is the alkanet. This is what you see in the summertime, and this is what you see when it puts out its flowering stalks, right? And then, of course,
It is happening somewhere in the end of summer. August, right?
no, not this one. No, these are all, they all flower in winter. This one, by the way, the most, of course, the common flowers, besides for the geophytes that are very beautiful, but flowers that are very colorful and so on, are the annuals. And one of the common ones is flowering now. They're called hollyhocks, and they're very, very tall. Now, annuals, it's amazing when you think of it as an annual plant, because when we think of annuals, we think of plants that grow from seeds. They're usually not very large. Annuals live for 1 year or less. They germinate, the seeds germinate, you've got the plant goes through its life cycle with a flower, with pollination and so on, and produces new seeds, and the seeds are usually in the ground and stay there until the next winter. And we will see an example also. For example, in the desert, we have plants that keep their seeds over the entire summer, and the seeds only germinate if it rains enough. If it doesn't rain enough, the seeds will go through a dry winter, which happens quite often in the desert, and germinate only when there is sufficient rain. So these are the annuals. The reason I brought you the hollyhock as an example is that because when we see this this tall flower, which can sometimes reach, be close to 2 meters tall, it's hard to think of it as an annual. Many people really like it and wait until there are seeds, and then they collect the seeds and plant them in their gardens, so you can see them there.
But they are not ready yet. I mean, they are typically in March. Not now.
We're in the middle of February.
Yeah, so in the month.
And it also, okay, another thing, we spoke about plants being, we spoke about endothermic and ectothermic animals, and I told you that actually plants are all ectothermic. Plants are very dependent on temperature for their rate of development. So what happens is, where do you live? In Yerushalayim. That things will flower here later than they flower in the Tel Aviv area. Over there it's warmer, they'll start flowering earlier. And it's very interesting to see also with the almond trees, because you can see the different times of flowering. That where it's warmer, they'll flower earlier, and then where it's colder. So we spoke about the plant species, and we spoke a bit about different plant life forms. And now we're going to talk about the vegetation as we find it in different geographic areas. And the main factor that affects vegetation is climate. Obviously, there are also other things. We can see, for example, difference between northern and southern slopes. In this region, it's very obvious. On the northern slope, there's a lot more vegetation because the water regime there is better, and because there's less, the sunlight is not so strong and it's not so hot. But